The TLDR is that this is a very cool setting and pretty much its own game that just uses D&D 5th edition as an underlying system. But largely it has nothing to do with D&D, and I like it a lot. I'm just a little confused by it, but I do like it. And maybe what impressed me most is how good and useful this book is, not just in the content, but also in the layout and the amount of resources that are included in it. Okay, let's get into it. Broken Weave is marketed as a 5e supplement, but reading through this book, it actually has very little to do with D&D 5th edition. This is pretty much its own D20 system, and calling it a 5e supplement is like calling any D&D inspired D20 fantasy game a 5e supplement. Like it's like calling 13th Age or Pathfinder a supplement. Sort of. Not really. Maybe I went a bit too far there. But it does have its own classes, which are largely incompatible with your regular 5e games, and regular 5e classes are not really going to work in the Broken Weave. It also has multiple new and unique subsystems, and actually those you can probably just take them as they are and use them in your 5e games. And there are even like new skills. There are no spells in this game because of the lore. Instead you get talents, which are totally different. It's a different game. And it's one of those games where the setting is tied pretty heavily to the mechanics. Having said all of that, it's probably one of the coolest D&D related things I've read recently. Okay, so what is Broken Weave? Broken Weave is a 5e-esque game that takes place in a world that has undergone some sort of magical apocalypse. The weave of magic has collapsed, the gods have died, and the force that was magic has entropied into decay. Decay is a very real presence in this story, and it has multiple mechanical consequences. There is a decay saving throw. Monsters can inflict decay on you, and you can suffer decay by going to certain places, but if you suffer too much of it, your character can turn into a monster, which has some really cool flavor and lore around it, and you can also fight decay with hope. Hope is a meta currency in Broken Weave, which I like a lot. You can also spend hope to just do cool stuff and generally keep your character alive, but then you won't have enough hope to fight decay, and I just really like that mechanic. This is a weird product. If you compare this to stuff from Kobold Press or just other 5e supplements, it's usually stuff that you can pretty easily integrate and expand with 5e games. And there are things here you can definitely use, like the Haven system or the Journey system, which we can talk about in a bit. But if you want to play Broken Weave and really kind of experience what this book is about, you really need to get your group bought into, we're kind of going to play D&D 5th edition, but not really, actually not at all, which I think will only work for a specific type of group where either they have played 5e and want something different, but are not willing to venture too far away from that core system. But if it's one of those groups that only wants to play 5e, I think this can actually be a harder sell because you can't use 5e classes, and the new classes here, while very cool, are pretty different in how they work. Now, maybe it's unfair to say that you can't use this supplement with 5e. You can. There are tons of monsters in here that you can just lift and use. And like I said, there are a lot of other subsystems that you could use. But as a package, it's very much its own thing, and I like it a lot. I think it's a great product, and I wish I had the physical book just because it looks so beautiful. But I'm also confused by it. I guess it makes more business sense to tie this to 5e because there's a bigger audience there, but I would be very interested to see how this works with Cubicle 7's own new D20 system that's supposed to come out at some point. Personally, I kind of wish that they used their D6 system, the same one that they use in Soulbound and The Laundry, because that system already has so many of the design principles that the Broken Weave has, like downtime endeavors and all the meta currencies and talents, and overall I just think it's a really good and fun system that I personally enjoy more than D&D, and of course everything must be tailored to my specific preferences. No, but I get it. Using a D20 system makes it more accessible to more people, and that's a good thing, and that's cool. Okay, let's move on. Okay, so with that out of the way, let's get into the book itself. So the foundation for everything here is the setting. This is a post-apocalyptic fantasy world. It's grim, it's dark, it does not have the vibe of big heroes on an epic fantasy quest, and it is all the way up my alley. But you have to know the vibe that this book is going for. You have to know it going in. It's not a hopeless story, but hope is fleeting. I don't think that this setting will lend itself to regular D&D shenanigans or escapades or tomfoolery or hijinks. Why am I like this? I love the way the book handles the setting and the lore. They could have easily spent a million pages just fleshing out every little thing, which a lot of books do. I'm looking at you, Symbaroum. It's cool, but it's a lot. These things can be cool to read, but usually not actually useful in every session. Here, they give you a short but very to-the-point description of what the setting is, the vibe, and how to make it your own. And this can easily be, for example, the Forgotten Realms after some big magical apocalypse. And by the way, when I say short, I do mean short. There's only like 1 or 2 pages that you need to read in order to write, to kind of understand what they're going for. There are also about 30 pages at the end of the book that go a little bit deeper into the lore, but most of those pages are things you can actually use directly, like in a session, like places and people and conflict. Then we jump right into haven creation. Havens are a big part of Broken Weave. These are the settlements and communities that the remaining survivors in this world live in. There's a resource management aspect here where you need to make sure that your haven has enough resources, people, and hope. And you also have to fight decay like we talked about earlier. I like the approach here because it's not too heavy-handed. There's no overly complicated haven management system. You're free to just play the game and do cool stuff, but the game gives the GM and the players a lot more tools to inflict mechanical consequences based on the narrative. The idea of you doing something to protect the haven, and then that gives you more hope, which you can then use to resist decay or do some other cool stuff, can create some pretty compelling stories. And this is what I like about this book. It's not just, hey, here's a cool concept and you may or may not actually use it. Instead, it gives you a concept and then it gives you simple tools to actually incentivize you and the players to use it. Haven creation is a narrative and mechanical exercise. There's basically a character sheet for the haven, but it's also a world building exercise. It has 5 steps. First, you determine the founder's legacy. What is this haven about? What did the founders seek to achieve by founding this place? Was this about giving exiles from other havens a home? Was it about protecting the corpse of some massive dead god? Or was this a staging area for attacks on raiders, bringing the fight back to them? Next, we determine the location, which is made up of 3 different aspects. First is biome, which is the environment. So is this haven underground or in a jungle? Second is abundance and scarcity. Like, for example, we have lots of salt, but no clean water. This is cool because then you need to think of, well, why would this environment be rich in one resource but scarce in another? Maybe it's because of enemies, maybe it's because of just lack or abundance of natural resource. And the third aspect is a landmark. What's a unique feature of the land around you? Is this haven located near a massive geyser that projects blood, or is it in some ancient battlefield? Each of these things has really good rollable tables that you can use to randomize these things or just pick from, and they all have mechanical impacts on the game. Next, you go through a similar exercise to determine the culture and leadership of the haven, and probably most interestingly, you need to add a crisis and some internal conflict in the haven. And by the way, you can later suffer more internal conflict in your haven as a result of decay. Finally, the finishing touches are giving the haven a name and assigning stats for decay, hope, population, and resources. Population and resources, by the way, are kind of like the haven's HP. When the haven suffers attacks or damage, it reduces the resources and then the population. So legacy, location, culture, crisis, and stats. You will end up with a lot of world building after creating a haven. The book also gives you a fully fleshed out example haven, complete with its own sheet and its own lore, and all of that is part of the lore section of the book. As I said, every page is useful. Next is survivor creation, which is vaguely similar to character creation in 5e, but as I mentioned earlier, you can't really use regular 5e classes here. I guess you could use these classes in regular 5e games, but I think you'll run into balance issues. What you definitely can use in any 5e game is the life path system, which is Similar to how you create havens in the last process, this is a step-by-step narrative process of generating interesting and well-rounded stories, this time about your characters, without having them, write a big long backstory. I'm not going to go through the whole thing here, but what I like about it is that this is basically what generates the proficiencies and extra attribute points beyond the standard array. So the game does give you a standard array that it asks you to use, for strength and dexterity and wisdom and all of that. But instead of just assigning additional points and having you choose proficiencies, it has to tie to something from your life path. So for example, you gain +1 wisdom because something happened in your past that taught you to always mind your surroundings. Or you get proficiency in survival because once you had to trail a monster into the wilderness to rescue a friend. All of these things give you basically prompts, stuff that happened in the background of your character. What vanilla D&D calls race is called lineage here. And you can be a dwarf, elf, halfling, human, or the Forgotten, which is basically any other fantasy race you want. I mentioned earlier that I like how this book handles lore because it doesn't just dump 500 pages of lore on you. It weaves the lore and into the stuff that you have to read in order to know how to play the game. So for example, each lineage has a different curse that it has to carry, and this is a part of your character when you create it. And that curse determines what happens to your character if you're going to suffer too much decay. For example, dwarves carry the curse of flame. The more decay you suffer as a dwarf, you'll start seeing these molten fire cracks form on the surface of your skin until you finally become this monster of stone and lava that turns against your friends. And there are stat blocks for these monsters. So if you ever meet these monsters on the battlefield, or the versions, for elves or humans or anything else, they used to be people. Each lineage has a different curse, so it already gives you another layer of lore for just random monsters that you meet. Then you choose your class. There are 6 classes here. There's the Herald, the Maker, the Sage, the Seeker, the Speaker, and the Warden. Which one do you think is your favorite?
The top.
Herald?
Yeah.
Yeah, it does look pretty cool. The Herald are strange, often ostracized survivors that have the ability to resist decay. Makers can basically build anything that a haven might need. Sages are guides and keepers of forgotten lore and healers. Seekers are basically rangers. They're explorers and hunters. Speakers are the face. They're diplomats who are good at building connections between communities. And wardens are, big badass warriors. There are not really spells per se in this game. There are ways to integrate spells into them, but because of the whole magical apocalypse thing, there are talents instead, and just innate abilities. This is another place where I'm a little confused by the choice to make this based on 5e, because if the audience here are people who mostly play 5e, I think some of this is going to be confusing because it works just a little differently from how it works in 5e. And it might take a little getting used to, because you'll always be sort of comparing it to 5e classes. Like you're going to be comparing the Seeker to the Ranger. Characters in Broken Weave are generally stronger at lower levels than 5e characters and have access to more stuff, which I like, but I can definitely see how it will start being a bit of a burden to track all of this stuff that your character can do as you level up, especially because quite a bit of it is passive, stuff like auras or things that you can do as a reaction or things to just give you advantages on, certain saving throws or stuff like that. A lot of it is not necessarily active, spells or abilities that you use. Some of it is. There's obviously a lot more here. There are rules for harvesting resources. There are new actions you can use in combat. There are rules for injuries and healing that I think are way better than 5e rules, including a rule that says that failed death saves don't go away even after you heal, and you need multiple long rests or substantial treatment to heal them, which I like a lot. Or another rule called Last Stand, which means that when you're critically injured, you can take a turn where basically you're immune to damage, you get advantage on everything, you deal double damage, but by the end of that turn or at the end of that turn, you die permanently. No saves, no nothing. And doing that actually generates a lot of hope for your haven, because it's this inspiring, legendary last stand, and that's awesome. I absolutely love it. I also didn't get into the mechanics of hope and decay and how you can resist decay and you can spend hope. There are some really cool things. It's just a lot. I think it can be a lot. My advice, if you're pitching this game to your table, don't pitch it as, hey, we're going to play 5e, but a little bit different with different classes. Pitch it as a completely different game that just happens to use some similar mechanics to D&D, just like how Pathfinder or 13th Age, which is the best one, by the way, 13th Age is the best D&D. These games share a lot of mechanics with D&D. They are rooted in versions of D&D. They're the, roll a d20 and add a modifier is like the core system. And the same is true for Broken Weave, right? It's as I read through this book, the more I read into it, I was like, all right, this is its own game. Okay, two more things that I wanted to mention, and then we'll wrap up. One is the GM resources in this book are genuinely helpful. In a lot of books of this style, you get a lot of, what is a role-playing game type of text. This book is a bit more honest about the fact that if you're reading it, it's likely not your first TTRPG book, and it focuses the GM resources on how to capture the tragic and dark fantasy vibe that they're going for here, and lots of rollable tables that are good. Along with my trusty Ironsworn Oracles, the tables in that book that I use for basically every game, I'm sure I'm going to be using Broken Weave tables for lots of other games. And the final thing is the monsters. There are tons of monsters in this book, and environmental hazards and new travel rules, all of which are very cool, all of which you can use in 5e games, 13 Age games, anywhere you want. But I wanted to call out the monsters specifically because they have amazing art. Each monster has lore and advice on how to run it and how to describe it, how to role play and fight as that monster. And there are many of them, and each one of them has all of this. Definitely read these stat blocks before running them because they're big. It's a lot. This is a very good bestiary, and you can definitely just lift this and, play it in other games. Overall, I'm just really impressed with this book. The sheer amount of stuff that's in here is pretty wild. Almost every complaint that I have is not about Broken Weave, but it's with the underlying D&D system. I still feel this might have been better as its own thing or with a bit of a different system, and I almost missed this, by the way, because of the 5e thing. Because I play 5e, but I don't really like to run it. So I thought, why would I want to buy a 5e supplement? But the setting just looked so cool. So I grabbed the PDF, and then I was like, holy crap, this is a completely different thing, and it's awesome. So I wanted to make a video about it. So I did. And now we're done. So go check it out and go play a game.
Bye, everybody.
Bye, everybody.
We'll see you soon later today.
Today?
We hope you have fun.
You hope they have fun playing Broken Weave?
Yes.
What other games can they play?
You can play whatever you like.